Mostly on this channel, we talk about the discoveries made by scientists, but occasionally we talk about science itself and what is the process that scientists go through to be able to find their discoveries. It's more of a philosophical question. And you've probably noticed recently that science is under attack by many fronts. There is a just general distrust in science that is happening, and there are a million causes to this. We can point fingers in all kinds of directions. But my guest today is Dr. Paul Sutter, and he feels that scientists themselves have some responsibility in the place that we find ourselves in. And he recommends some sort of specific things that scientists can look at to try to fix these problems from their side of the situation. The new book he's got is called Rescuing Science, and I've had a chance to read it. I really enjoyed it, and I think you'll enjoy this conversation with Dr. Paul Sutter. Paul, it's great to see you again.
Oh, it's so good. It's been way too long.
I know. And this is a funny situation because it feels like 5 years ago or so. I'm not sure when you actually started. You're like, I got a book and I don't know what to do with it. I had to get all these ideas out of my head. Yep. And I have to gestate on this for a while. And you weren't even sure this book was ever going to come out.
I was not. I actually, it was about 5 years ago when I first got the seed of the idea for the book. And then I wrote the first draft in a sprint in the summer of 2020. So peak COVID summer. As I was watching in real time the erosion of distrust between science and the public. And so I'm like, okay, like this is it. Also, I have nothing to do because everything is closed. So I might as well like sit down and then like 2 months, I think 2 or 3 months, I just blazed through the first draft of the book. Sent it around. I had my agent send it around. It's been with the publisher that is publishing it now is the third publisher that has handled this book and worked with this book.
Right, with tongs and handed it over to the next.
Yeah, with gloves, oven mitts on, and because it's spicy. It's a spicy book. It's been through a lot of revisions, mostly minor. I mean, the main content of the book remained totally unchanged. But it's been an adventure to get this book out there. And you're right. There was serious chunks of time where I thought this thing is never going to make it to print. I will just self-publish it. I'll put it on my website or something. But no, we have a publisher. Roman Littlefield took up the challenge. We have a publisher. It is out there. It is coming out March 5th of 2024.
So what is the gist? What are you arguing?
What I am arguing is that I am observing a breakdown in trust between science and the public in big chunks of the public. And I don't know how to fix the public. I don't know how to change someone's mind. I've never been very good at it. I don't know what to say to someone who has decided that they are anti-science. I don't know what to say to them to change their mind. But what I do know how to do is be introspective and look inwards and ask, is there anything we could do differently as scientists? And as a community of science supporters, as fans of science, is there anything we can do to increase our trustability? And from there, hopefully garner more trust and more funding and make science a beloved institution that can last for generations.
So you focus on a few fairly large categories. I think there was seven,
yeah.
7 large categories. I see. That's right. That's why the 7 deadly sins reference you made near the end. Okay. All right. Yes. All right. But, let's sort of go through them a little bit. The first one you described as fraud. What is the heart of this?
Yeah, the heart of this is an academic culture. And when I talk about science, there are many aspects of science. There are many different kinds of people that do science. I am mostly focused on fundamental research in science. I'm talking about university scientists, publicly supported scientists doing the deepest kinds of research there is. There are many other scientists employed in industry and pharmaceutical companies and in working for the government. And that's a different kind of science that I talk about in the book, but I don't focus on. And in academic research, there is this phrase, which is publish or perish. You must publish papers, and you must publish a lot of papers starting at a very early phase in your career and continuing. If you want to get into grad school, you need to publish. If you want your PhD, you got to publish. If you want research positions, you got to publish. If you want to become a faculty member or a research scientist, you got to publish. If you want tenure, grants, promotion, the whole thing, you have to publish. There's this culture where we expect scientists to publish not just a little, I mean publish a lot. And this number blew me away when I first encountered it. Last year in 2023, can you guess? I love asking my interviewers this question. Can you guess how many scientific papers were published worldwide in 2023?
I'm going to guess 500,000 to a million.
500,000 to a million? It's 5.1 million.
5 million.
In 2023, there were over 5 million scientific articles published. There are 30,000 English language journals in the world. We are publishing way too much. This pressure to publish, one, is making it so that there is so much useless research being published. Like, there is a lot of just poor quality research, uninteresting research, not fruitful or interesting or boundary pushing research. We're just publishing for the sake of publishing. And we're creating the culture where fraud can thrive. Retractions are through the roof. Suspicion of fraud. There's been anonymous polls taken of scientists. When scientists are asked, hey, have you ever fudged the numbers in your paper? Somewhere around 25% admit to fudging their numbers in their paper. When asked, have you outright lied and fabricated results? A handful of a percent, less than 5%, admit to it, which is way more than it should be. And then when you turn around and ask, what about your colleagues and your peers? Have you encountered instances of fraud and personally witnessed it, but not participated in it? It's over 3/4. So 3/4 of scientists have witnessed fraud in publication research. And what this is creating is a culture where the public has a hard time trusting science, because actually sometimes we do lie. Sometimes our papers are fake. Sometimes our papers are not real. Sometimes the numbers are fudged. And we aren't doing a very good job at policing it. We're not doing a very good job at guarding against it, because anyone who has the qualifications to judge against fraud, which is other scientists, are just too busy publishing their own papers in the first place. And so we're not catching it, we're not spotting it, and we're not squashing it like the cancer that it is. We are allowing it to happen. We are permitting it to happen. And so, of course, the public sees scientists are becoming distrustful of scientists, because we are sometimes lying and we're getting caught doing it, and we're not doing much about it.
And I mean, that publish or perish, the entire industry is focused. If you look at all of the things you do as a scientist, none of it matters except for the number of papers you publish in high quality journals. That if you show up in Nature a bunch of times, then nothing else is relevant. And that's really all people are looking for when they hire you as a scientist.
Absolutely. When I was a junior scientist, when I was a graduate student, a postdoc, I would ask every single senior scientist I encountered, what can I do? What can I do to increase the chances of me getting a job? The answer, without fail, every single time was publish a lot of papers. I am not kidding. That was every single advice. The only piece of advice I ever got.
Yeah, not do good science, not discover something really interesting.
No, it was write papers.
Write papers, yeah.
Write papers.
And everything just feeds from that. Whether you if you've got a lot of high profile ones, then that's great. If you don't have a lot of high profile ones, maybe you're not right for this job.
Yep, and exactly. And
Yeah.
even that pressure to write high profile papers, that means big impact, big statement, going for gold, final pass during the Super Bowl, like go big, but that itself creates a feedback mechanism where if you have a marginal result or an uninteresting result, you might be tempted to juice that result a little bit to make it a little bit more interesting, a little bit bigger. Maybe you find a way to shrink those error bars a little bit more so you can make a bolder statement. And that itself causes fraud.
And you think about like the vast majority of research that is done leads to a null result that you were hope maybe this is the way. Nope, that wasn't it. Maybe this is it. Nope, that's not it. And yet so the vast majority of papers should be we looked for something and we didn't find it. And so we had to reject the idea.
Yeah.
You don't see those papers.
The vast majority of papers are, we looked for something and hey, look, we found it. Isn't that funny? At a 2.8 sigma confidence level, right on the edge of a publishable result. And because we don't celebrate null results, because they don't garner, like a publication in Nature in a big high impact journal, a null result, even though that's such critically useful information. We tend to bury those when we do that work, we get a null result and it just goes in the drawer. We don't publish it. Or we get tempted to keep working on it and keep massaging it and keep nudging it and force it to be a publishable result.
Right. So kind of incentives that are pushing more publishing, less null results, and so on.
Just
so what's your
less fact checking, less integrity in the research and publication process.
So what's the next sort of cause that you have identified?
Of a lack of trust is ironically, like there's a flip side to this, pursuit of high impact publications, which is the funding side of things, which is the grant process. The vast majority of fundamental research done in the United States is funded by national agencies like NASA, the National Science Foundation, National Institute of Health, Department of Energy, and so on. And this is a model widely adopted worldwide. Grant applications and grant funding decisions are actually incredibly risk averse. If you have a crazy idea, if you have an interesting idea, if you really want to push in a new direction, you are highly unlikely to get your research funded. Instead, funding agencies tend to prefer programs or projects or proposals that are like what you've done before with a tiny little twist or a tiny little advancement. And we see that even at the biggest scales, like the biggest particle accelerators, the biggest biological laboratories, the biggest observatories. These are all what we did before, but we're just going to keep doing it. And so I believe that this leads to a lack of trust because science promotes itself and scientists promote themselves. People fall in love with science for the cutting edge work, for the crazy ideas that may not pan out, the creative thinking about the universe and problem solving and striking out into the unknown and coming up with a crazy idea. And that is simply not what gets funded. And instead, it becomes an institution where the goal of science becomes securing the next grant, making sure that the money doesn't stop. And so we have become incredibly risk averse across many disciplines where we are very afraid of funding risky projects. And so science becomes like not very interesting and science becomes very dull and not engaging. And it's seen as just yet another thing that the federal government funds amongst its many, many other things, and not as something special or unique that speaks to all of humanity.
And you can see from the perspective of a scientist who has a family and is attempting to just make sure that they can put food on the plate, that if they want the best chance at getting the grant, they're going to propose the research that has the likeliest chance of getting funded. They've got students that they have to continue employing. They have research assistants. There's all of this infrastructure. And the more successful you are, the more pressure there is to maintain this this group that continues
Keep
to
the
do
machine
this
going.
work.
Yeah,
Keep the machine going.
absolutely. And that is because we have set up the culture where this is the expectation. We have set up like the people who decide who get scientists, which scientists are awarded with grants, are other scientists. We all sit on each other's review committees. And we have decided that this is the best path forward because we have trained the public and trained especially policymakers that science should be a safe bet, that failure is not an option, that we are going to look, we had these measurable impacts and we reduced this uncertainty. We had this achievement. Now we're going to do it again. And that's an easy sell to policymakers. But I think that's because we haven't properly communicated to policymakers and to the public the true value in science, which is full of blind alleys, full of mistakes, full of wrong ideas, because how else do you explore the unknown?
And so it's like you're led into these cul-de-sacs.
Yeah.
And then there's all these other
traps.
places.
Yeah.
What's next?
What's next is honestly the lack of careers. And this is something that is not talked about nearly enough, which is we encourage young people to go into science, to go into STEM, to get STEM degrees, to become scientists. And it breaks my heart. This one really hurts me when kids come up and say, how do I be an astrophysicist? How do I be an astronomer? How do I be a scientist? Or parents come up like, my kid is interested in science. What do I do? I have to be honest with them, which is that there are essentially no jobs. To give you some measure of what's going on here, for every 10 PhDs that we produce in the United States, there is one open faculty position. So for every 10 PhDs that we produce, the majority are not going into science. They do not end up in careers in science. Roughly a third of them, at the time they get their PhD, this is according to the National Science Foundation, roughly a third of them have no plans. They have no job. They don't even have a job lined up. And these are our best and brightest people. The good news is that a lot of these people, most of them do end up in very fulfilling and fruitful careers because the skills you gain in science training, especially in graduate school, problem solving, analytic thinking, abstract thinking, being able to work under deadlines and with pressure with complex tasks. Like these are incredibly valuable skills. So the good news is there are jobs out there for people with PhDs in the sciences, but it's not doing science.
Yeah. There's a lot of people that I talk to who are like in the computer industry. They work at Google and are doing machine learning algorithms and so on, but they're trained as an astrophysicist. They have a PhD in astrophysics and couldn't secure a career in that. And now they're, they have a fallback job of a high paying career at a large, FANG, entity.
Yeah, exactly.
Facebook, et cetera.
Exactly.
Yeah, but that's not what they wanted. That wasn't the plan. The plan was to study dinosaurs. The plan was to understand the nature of the cosmos.
Look at the stars. Yeah, exactly. And it's okay. I'm going to say it's okay for us to have a lot of graduate students. It's okay to have a lot of bachelors. I'm fine with there being a lot of physics and astronomy and biology and chemistry PhDs out in the world. But we need to be absolutely clear to them from the very beginning about the realistic career prospects. And we need to retune our graduate and undergraduate programs so that this is the default expectation that you will not end up in a job in science. Instead, we're going to train you to have awesome skills. You're going to learn a little bit about the universe. You will participate in some cutting edge research, and then you will go with our support and blessing out into the world and make the world a better place. That is not the message you get. You can look at any physics, and this does vary by field. Some fields are very aware of this and very proactive about it. My fields of physics and astronomy are not proactive at it at all. You can go to any departmental website in physics and astronomy. You will find almost no mention of careers in industry. Also, the most telling factor here is that I am not aware of a single graduate program in the sciences that tracks what their graduates do post-graduation and reports that and measures that and makes that publicly available. I am not aware of a single program. I could be wrong. There could be some out there, but I have not encountered a single one. So you have to ask, usually colleges, universities are very proud of what their graduates do, the accomplishments they make, how much money they make, their career. This is not mentioned by graduate programs in the sciences, and I have to wonder why.
Well, it does feel like there is you talked about like postdocs, that there is a group of people that are working for incredibly low wages doing the sort of the grunt work that is required to progress a lot of science, with the carrot in front of them that if you put in this time, you put in this work, you're going to come out the other side and you're going to get a career you're going to be a scientist, you're going to get tenure. Yep. This is the track. But the reality is it's the 1 in 10. So in fact, they're delaying that reality and being told where they should be going.
And I call this phase the career, the gauntlet, where you go through undergrad, you work for 5 to 7 years to get a PhD. And if you want a career in fundamental research science, you have to keep going. Typically, almost all fields incorporate something called the postdoc, a postdoctoral research position, which is a short-term 2 to 5 year appointment somewhere else where you work for somebody else, get paid better than a graduate student, but not nearly what a tenured faculty will make. Then you might have to do it again. In some fields, you have to do it a third time. And then you're finally considered appropriate to even apply for a tenured position. And then in those positions, you have a 5-year window typically to prove yourself, especially in research. You have 5 years to prove yourself, and then you get tenure. But by the time you are even applying for faculty positions, you're in your early 30s. You are hoping to have a family, maybe own a home, have kids. But instead, you are moving every 2 to 5 years, several times in your life before you can even be considered for a faculty position. And even then, you are not guaranteed to have that job. There are many top tier institutions that have a horribly evil practice. When they have one faculty opening, they will hire 2 people on the tenure track, knowing that only one of them will end up making the cut. So it's like Thunderdome in there, like intellectual Thunderdome. 2 scientists enter, 1 scientist leaves. And this is considered a standard and healthy practice. And so, of course, it's toxically competitive. Of course, people stab each other in the back. Of course, what you think you're selecting for the best and brightest scientific minds, but really you're selecting for people who are willing to deal with all the BS. And that is a different set of skills. So ironically, we are taking the smartest people, the Einsteins, and they are looking at this and saying, there's no way I am putting myself through that. I'd rather go work on Wall Street or Silicon Valley or start my own consulting firm and make 5 to 10 times the salary and work a normal job and have a family and a home. So there's this perverse set of incentives, and I believe that this is leading to a lack of trust because we are outright lying to people.
What's next?
What's next is a very, very tricky topic, which is the politicization of science and examining the role that science plays in politics. Because in the United States, we are in a situation right now where, one, the overall trust in science has dropped. This is according to Pew Research polls, has dropped by nearly 20% over the past 3 years. When you compare pre-COVID to post-COVID, we have lost something like 17% of Americans when they come to trusting science. And the largest fraction of that drop comes from Republicans, comes from conservative-minded people. And so what we are starting to see over the past several years is an attachment of science, and not just specific avenues of science or research topics, but science as an institution becoming more and more attached to the Democratic Party. Part of this is a response to short-term survival, because the past few Republican administrations, most notably the administration of Donald Trump, has proposed lower budgets for NASA and the NSF and the NIH, and has wanted to like close NOAA and meteorological, that has taken a stance of trying to reduce public spending in science. And so the natural response to that is to, okay, if one party is seeming anti-science and another party is seeming pro-science, then maybe I should align myself with the pro-science party and support Democratic initiatives, support Democratic candidates, and be more closely tied to that. The worry I have with that is that that is a short-term gain, but we're going to pay for that. And we're going to pay for that because the Democrats, one political party, is not going to be in charge all the time. And I would prefer that science was funded every single term. I would prefer that science was funded for years to come, continuously funded for years, decades, and hopefully centuries. I would prefer that no matter who's on the ballot box, that science always wins. And so I believe it's a mistake that a lot of, especially academic researchers, are making in aligning more closely with the Democratic platform and endorsing candidates. What this is doing, and my prime example of this is the March for Science. What this is doing is alienating people. It is not creating a broad base of support for science. So the March of Science, for example, this happened shortly after the inauguration of Donald Trump in 2016. He became president. And immediately, and part of his platform was defunding science and anti-science statements. And justifiably, a lot of scientists were very upset about this and very worried. So they organized a March for Science. The slogan was out of the lab and into the streets. Get out there and protest the policies of this administration. So I believe that was a mistake, because yes, scientists should be vocal. Yes, they should express their political views. And yes, we need more visibility of science. We need people to understand the value and importance of science in society. But it was very transparently an anti-Donald Trump and anti-Republican march, which by itself is okay. If you want to protest Donald Trump, go right ahead. If you want to protest Joe Biden, go right ahead. Have 10 of like that as part of our free political expression. And I do believe that scientists need to be more vocal and have a voice in the political process. But because this march was so transparently anti-Republican, any Republican watching the news, watching the coverage, hearing about the March for Science, that did not convince them about the value and importance of science in their lives. It convinced them that science is a Democrat-aligned institution. And that therefore, if science is a Democrat-aligned institution, it's okay to vote against them because it's just one of the many things that other party does that we don't support. And so that was the mistake. It made it almost too transparent and too naked. And that when scientists speak politically, we should seek, I believe, to serve the best interests of the nation, and we should seek to serve the interests of people who would typically vote against scientists. I would much rather build bridges, find out how can we connect to deep Republican voters? How can we connect to policymakers who happen to be Republican, who serve on very important committees or make policy statements? How do we reach those people and build bridges to them and communicate the importance and value of science to them in a way that they would understand and appreciate, rather than simply falling into the all too easy trap of dividing along political lines?
But I think about like historically funding for, say, space exploration, that there were people on both sides of the aisle who were huge boosters of space exploration. And in general, you had people deep in Republican, deep in Democratic houses that were building bills together. In many cases, they were trying to allocate funding to their various districts, understandably. And then the same thing goes for science. Like there didn't for the longest time feel like there was a bias one way or the other about whether or not the Hubble Space Telescope should be built or whether or
Mm-hmm.
not we should. But that has definitely crept in, and you talk about that in the book as well, the sort of the source of this. Maybe that's the next one we go into, I think. But there are moneyed interests that are attempting to drive this, and you feel that a political response is the wrong one. But if how do you respond to a political response without a political response?
Yeah,
I mean, I'm Canadian, so I don't know how any of this stuff works, right? So,
absolutely. And so I believe that scientists are making a mistake. Several mistakes. One of the mistakes of scientists and supporters and fans of science is actually not being political enough, ironically. There's this culture, especially in academia, that scientists are outside of politics. We don't talk about that. We don't get messy. We don't get our hands dirty. I think that's the wrong approach, because what happens is that the words of scientists and the voice of scientists are being taken from them and being used by politicians without the scientists' understanding or awareness or their own participation. I do believe that science has a seat at the table. I think the mistake is that on one hand, scientists are not being vocal enough. They are not participating enough. They are not sharing their views enough, and especially sharing their passions and the role that science plays in society. I think the public needs to learn much more about that science isn't just a bunch of cool ideas. Science is actually a vitally important pillar of our modern civilization. Most people do not make that connection, and I think they should. And the second is that when scientists do enter politics, they mix up the science views with the policy views. As an example, climate change, which has been the topic surrounding climate change, has been the main driver in the wedge, especially between conservatives and scientists. And yes, our Earth is warming. It's getting warmer, and it's our fault. And yes, it's going to have devastating consequences. Absolutely. What we do about that is a very, very difficult question. And that's a question that in the United States, for example, over 300 million people need to agree on, or at least find some way to build a consensus around, so that we can make decisions about what to do about it. And of course, any response to climate change is going to impact some people and not impact others. It will impact people disproportionately. If we are going to solve climate change, we all have to pay some sort of price. No one wants to be the one left holding the bag. So, of course, they are going to have strong opinions about who should pay the price to mitigate the effects of climate change. That is precisely why we have such a complex, multi-layered political decision-making process, so that we can sort this out, so that different groups and different people can have their voice heard, so that we can elect our representatives, so that they can pass legislation, so that they could make these kinds of decisions. And thoughts or opinions or feelings about how well functioning that system is aside, that is at least the ideal. And I believe what happened, particularly with climate scientists, is that they mixed up the science, which is legit, like we are totally messing up our planet and we should do something about it, with specific policy recommendations.
and is that is that very similar to sort of like what you saw with COVID, that there was the night and day work by epidemiologists who are tracking the rise of this disease. They were passing along recommendations to public officials. Public officials were attempting to implement it, and it got messy.
It got very messy and very ugly very quickly. I don't know if I would have done a better job than Fauci. Like, that was an unpleasant and difficult and probably impossible position to be in any sort of public health official. But what I saw, especially with COVID, and I saw echoes of this with the early climate change discussions, which was going beyond the bounds of the evidence. So, for example, with climate change, do you remember like Al Gore's An Inconvenient Truth, the PowerPoint that won a Nobel Prize? A lot of what he said was accurate and grounded in science. Also, a lot of the predictions he made, like the disasters that would befall us on certain timescales, that went beyond the bounds of the evidence. If you look at, say, climate projections over the next 10 or 20 years, there's a very wide margin of what the Earth's temperature will look like. There's also a lot of uncertainty about what the specific effects will be. It's very, very tough to predict the outcome of increased carbon output. And by laying out predictions, we open ourselves up to making a mistake. And I think that in the early climate change discussion, there was a lot of like doom and gloom, and we need to fix this now. And the polar bears are drowning, which they are, but like they're drowning and they're going to start eating your kids. And like it was too much because it was mixed up with what we do about it.
Mm-hmm.
But I imagine,
But I can imagine if you are attempting to, if you provide the research impassionate and go, okay, here you go, 1.5 degrees warming by 2024, do with that what you will.
Yeah,
I'm not going to think
exactly.
About it.
And I think the climate scientists I've seen in the community over the past 5 to 10 years make this shift in messaging and making it much more personal and much more grounded in the evidence that we have. Like, hey, have you noticed that like winters are a lot more mild than they used to, and there isn't as much snow? That's not your imagination. We know what causes that. Hey, have you noticed that there are a lot more wildfires than there used to be? Yeah, it's not your imagination. We actually know what's causing that. Have you noticed that hurricanes are stronger and more frequent? You can run down the list of the effects of climate change and use that to speak more personally to people. And I believe that's much more powerful than like a doom and gloom, we're all going to die scenario.
But like when you, if you go right back to the heart of the term politics, right? Policy, that you are saying, we know, we've measured this change in rising. We know what the cause is, that we think these are the implications. And now it's time for policy to deal with the implications. It's time for politics to agree on how they're going to respond. And I don't know how, that all feels inevitable to me, whether it's epidemiologists saying we're looking at this many people are going to possibly die. Someone has to figure out how to deal with this, whether we wear masks or don't, that there are issues with global warming. We need to come up with effective policies. I don't know how you can both inform the public about the things that are possible, that are probabilistic issues, without it turning into a political conversation. And I agree that I don't think things should be political, but I just don't know how, because I talk about how cool space is, and you do too, right? We talk about how amazing the Andromeda galaxy is, and then people write nasty comments about how they wish we didn't get involved in politics.
And it's this weird irony, because I actually want scientists more involved in politics. I want us to have more of a voice, but I want us to be honest, and I want us to speak as scientists, so that someone says, and I want more scientists to say, I don't know, or we don't know. Like, oh, if we do this, what are the effects going to be? We don't know. Or speak with all the usual caveats and uncertainties that we use in scientific publications, like, oh, well, assuming this and this, here's our projection. That's what we got. And of course, there are pressures, outside pressures. People don't want the nuance. People don't want the complexity. They want it boiled down, yes or no, good idea or bad idea. And we as scientists have the freedom to remain silent. We can say, I'm not going to boil it down for you. I'm not going to pick A or B. I'm going to tell you what the caveats are and what the uncertainties are. And that is where I'm going to stop. And you can take it or leave it. So maintaining scientific integrity in our communications, for example, going back to the COVID-19
This kind of
pandemic.
segues into the next part of the conversation, though, doesn't it?
Yes, this aspect of like disdain, and that scientists sometimes do act like know-it-alls. There was this line in the Oppenheimer movie that really cut me deep. It was there was some comment like, "Oh, physicists don't like it when you question their judgment, especially when you're not one of them." I was like, "Ouch!" Like that hurt, but also it's kind of true. I've witnessed this myself. I experienced this myself. There is this culture of superiority, of arrogance, of knowing the real answer, that because we are scientists and we study nature deeply, therefore maybe we are capable of making these kinds of complex policy decisions, and that we are capable, that we're smarter than the philosophers and the artists and the economics majors and everybody else, and what we can make these decisions. This is we have so many examples from public scientists, making these kinds of comments, just trashing other disciplines, speaking down about people. And then, when it feels good when people come to you with questions and want you to have the answer, that's a good sensation. It's kind of thrilling. And so it's very easy to fall into traps of, oh, okay, you want me to boil down and okay, let me use my superpowered science brain and I will tell you the answer. And that gets us into traps. And it got us into a lot of traps with COVID-19.
And I think you see scientists who are using, say, maybe their expertise in one field to then start to delve into other fields that they don't have any experience in, with a high degree of certainty that is possibly unwarranted. That, of course, there's more nuance. I think, you have actually done a remarkably restrained job of sticking to cosmology and astrophysics and stuff, and dance.
And dance, cheese. There is that.
And cheese.
I don't dance, for the record. I work with dance experts to do the dance. I outsource the dancing. I do not have the arrogance to believe that I am a good dancer.
But cheese.
Oh, cheese. I'm an amateur cheese enthusiast, and I love cheese, and I will eat any cheese you put in front of me. Even that one from Sicily with maggots in it or whatever. I'll give it a shot.
Right.
But I am also not a cheeseologist, and I classify cheese by their proximity to me, which increases their desirability. Beyond that, I do not know much about the ins and outs of cheese.
So I want to move on to the next one, which is just science communication, and this is sort of like the heart of what we both do now for our careers. How do you think that science communication is contributing to the problems that we have in science in general?
Yeah, we as scientists do not communicate with the public nearly enough. And I believe that this is leading to a lack of trust because people don't get to identify with science. They don't get to connect with science. They see the headlines, they see, the big splashy news, but they don't realize that a practicing working scientist is probably within their family and friend orbit. They are probably less than 2 steps away from like an actual practicing research scientist. And so they don't build up personal connections with scientists. Then they don't understand where scientists are coming from. They don't understand our methodology. They don't understand how we arrive at our decisions. They see the big splashy stuff, which often contradicts, whatever was published a year ago. There's always headlines saying, oh, it turns out the Big Bang was wrong. That happens like every year. And they don't see how we arrive at our decisions. And that takes personal communication. That takes personal sharing. That takes revealing of scientists' personal passion about their work, which doesn't happen nearly enough. And it doesn't happen because scientists have absolutely no incentives to do it. If you want to get promoted, if you want tenure, if you want grants, one of the last things you can do is communicate your science to the public. At best, it will be treated as a neutral, and more likely than not, it will be to your detriment, because a committee panel will say, oh, you communicate science a little bit too much. You should pull back on that. And we're not going to give you tenure, period. And that's horrible and that's awful. And of course, people are finding it harder and harder to trust scientists, because we are closing ourselves off more and more. We're not seen as human beings who are flawed, who are complex, who are working on interesting projects, who have a passion, who are following a very specific methodology to approach problem solving, and how our methodology is only applicable to a small subset of our natural human experience. But that's what makes it so powerful. People don't get to see that. And so we're like aliens living in universities that make pronouncements every once in a while that don't make any sense.
I had graduated from high school and was starting to begin my education at UBC for engineering. And I picked up on a whim Carl Sagan's Demon Haunted World, which you mentioned in the book. And I finally, for the first time, deeply understood the way the scientific process worked. And it was sort of like a new lens, a new way of looking at the kinds of research that was being talked about the amount of uncertainty that's involved, how it's all an unfolding process, how I don't know is a perfectly acceptable answer to many of the questions that we face. And I think, and I say I don't know all the time, you say I don't know all the time, but I think a lot of people, when they communicate the stuff, even if they don't know, they give an answer that gives off that they do know the answer. And when inevitably things switch around and it turns out that you thought coffee was good for you, now coffee's bad for you, oh, now coffee's good for you again, it's that whipsaw. And
or as a even bigger example, the whole COVID vaccine experience. The vaccine is powerful. I'm double or triple vaxxed or whatever. I also got COVID like 18 times. So I'm invincible now.
Right. You're half COVID.
I'm half COVID. Half my DNA is now COVID. The vaccine was overpromised. It was promised as, take this injection and COVID will be gone. It will be a memory. And yes, the vaccine was a miracle in a shot. It saved countless lives. It also did not eliminate COVID. And so when we came around with Omicron in the months following, and we're like, wait a minute, we all got vaccinated, but we're still getting sick. What is going on? COVID didn't go away. And people were upset with that, because I believe that the vaccine was overpromised. We went beyond the bounds of the evidence. We could have stuck to it and said, hey, if you take this vaccine, your chance of dying will be very, very low. You should do it.
Right.
And then ask the question, and then, well, what will happen to COVID? Will COVID go away? The correct answer to that was, I don't know.
Right. Yeah. I don't know. We've seen some examples where the vaccine completely eliminates the disease. And we've seen other examples where the vaccine decreases the severity of the illnesses, but we're stuck with it year after year, like the flu,
Yep, exactly.
RSV.
And the data we have right now says we don't know. And that's the best we can say. But it was instead sold as, this won't just save your life. It will make COVID completely go away and you never have to think about it again.
And so there's like two parts to that. I think there's this resistance by scientists to even do the communication in the first place, because there's absolutely no incentive to do so. In fact, there's a negative incentive to do so. They are punished by many institutions. And I have a bunch of my favorite scientists / science communicators. And I keep asking them this question, is it better yet? And they're like, nope, still the same. And then there is an unwillingness to reveal the full complexity and nuance that is required to appreciate the scientific process of saying, I don't know.
Yeah.
And
I think scientists need a lot of bravery. Also, we need to restructure our incentives within academia and any kind of scientific enterprise, however it's organized, We need to incentivize outreach and communication, because guess what? If you make scientists do it, they'll probably do it. It might be bad at first, but they'll get better. These are supposedly some of the brightest minds on the planet. They can figure it out. I have confidence in my fellow scientists. We can figure it out and how to do it and how to express uncertainty, how do we arrive at scientific consensus? How do we approach evidence gathering? Why do we have so many caveats when we publish a paper? What are the significance of those? I think we could do a better job, and it starts with doing it.
But being encouraged to do it, trained to do it, understanding the value of what it places in society, so that it's not people who are either they can't help themselves but communicate science because they go crazy if they didn't, or people who are, people like me who are just journalists, right? That I'm helping to do the communication. And if more scientists were able to do that work, then I'd be out of a job.
Yes, which would be unfortunate for you personally, but I think a net benefit for society.
I'd gladly do it.
Actually, honestly, there's enough room. There's enough room for journalists and specific and more scientists to speak more openly about their work. What I want, my dream scenario, is for the public to trust science, not because we are scientists and we have PhDs, but trust science because they understand the process and they understand our decision making and they understand how we arrive at conclusions, so that when we say something and we say, here is a statement, here are the uncertainties, here are the nuances, that there is enough trust that people can accept that message for what it is.
What's your last issue?
The last issue was the terrible state of diversity in science, and how we are doing a horrible, horrible job of finding talent amongst diverse communities and promoting them up and getting them on the track they need to be successful scientists. Blacks, African Americans, Latinos, Native Americans in the United States. I focus the book mainly on the United States because that's where I have my data. That's where I have surveys and numbers to base my arguments on, are horribly underrepresented in the sciences. And the vast majority of young Black, Native, Latino, minority populations, all those kids do not believe that science is a viable career path for them, and they're right. And this is heartbreaking on multiple levels, and also at it's like heartbreaking on a personal, like human level. And it's also heartbreaking on a grand strategy. We want the best minds and brightest minds, in our halls of academia, working on these problems. I always wonder, how many Einsteins are we leaving behind? How many absolutely brilliant kids are primed to be amazing scientists, but don't even have that option available to them because of societal circumstances, and also because us as scientific institutions, we do not find them. We are not proactive. We are not hiring them. We are not making viable career paths for them. We are making it hard for them every step of the way. And so they end up not even approaching science as a field. And then we are missing out on those brilliant minds. And that, I just wonder what we could have had if we were more proactive about diversity earlier on.
And you think about how issues affect different communities, and they require a scientific response to this issue. And yet, if certain communities aren't represented in the scientists' work, then they're not going to get the same kind of evaluation, and the clever solutions aren't going to come. They come from the people who have lived the experience. They know what the problems are. They've lived it, and they can incorporate clever solutions or interesting hypotheses in their work. It's like you write what when
exactly, because
right?
it's not about the color of a person's skin. It's about what that color represents as a human being, their lived experience, their background, their cultural identity, the way they think about things, the way they approach things. I want a diversity of minds in the scientific enterprise so that we can tackle long-standing old problems with some fresh perspectives, and so that we can discover some new problems. In the medical community, how long has it taken for women's health to be taken seriously? Because most medical research was performed by men on male bodies with male volunteers, focused on male health, and it's taken decades for women's health to be approach parity with our understanding of men's health, simply because there weren't enough women doctors, doing the research.
So you spend this entire book essentially identifying what you see as the problems. And you spend very little time on solutions. You have a bunch of here's an idea here, here's an idea there. Did you have to resist that urge? Did you?
I don't know. I would push back on that characterization. One of the major changes in the several rounds of revisions over the past few years has been to place a greater emphasis on proposed solutions. And I tried to balance each chapter roughly 1/4 of the chapter setting up the problem, diagnosing it, half the chapter discussing, the negative outcomes and where we go, and then the last quarter of every chapter talking about solutions. So I talk about the need to have higher standards when it comes to approaching fraud, how we need to be proactive with diversity, how we need to just force our fellow scientists to communicate more, and that we can, if they're not going to force themselves, we can write it into grants, we can write it into fundraising, funding expectations, a calling on scientists and fans of science and lovers of science to be more honest when they enter into political discussions and speak from the heart about their scientific views, but include the uncertainties and being brave enough to say, I don't know. We need to be more proactive with our students and graduate students. We need to be honest with them and more transparent about them, about their actual career prospects. I talk about grant funding, how we should just, at a certain level, just randomize it. Like once you pass a certain threshold, just make it a lottery. That'd be way more fair than this horrible system that we have now. We should favor younger scientists with grant funding over older ones. We should have more high risk, high reward projects funded. It should be a greater percentage of our portfolio. And how we need to train policymakers that this should be the expectation. That results are not guaranteed in science, and that we need to communicate back to the public. We need to complete the circle to teach them that most science ends up being a bad idea or a wrong idea. And that's not only fine, that is what we want, because it's only by having 10 bad ideas or wrong ideas that we find the one right idea. And so we need to support all those ideas in order to hit on that one.
But I guess for me, it feels like determining the response to the problems you identified requires a scientific response, that there are a whole bunch of ideas that have been proposed, not just by you, but by the thousands of people who you interact with on a regular basis. There are a lot of ideas, and a lot of ideas have been tested to some degree or another, but not in this let's solve this problem. And so it would be really interesting to me to sort of see how could we approach this policy issue scientifically and say, okay, does randomizing the grants give you the increased outcome that you were hoping for? Does increasing more funding for science communication, does that do the trick? Does, tracking the hiring prospects, have more people find jobs when they go through a program? So It would be interesting to know, this is the problems require a scientific response. And even just by doing that, it turns into, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Let's do it. Right? I will be the first to say, I don't know if any of my proposed solutions will work. I do not know.
Yeah.
Right there. I don't know.
I don't know.
But I do know what we have been doing for the past 30 years is definitely not working. So we definitely need to do something else. And here are some ideas for something else. Let's give it a shot. If it turns out I'm wrong, okay, fine, I'm wrong. And this will never work. And science is always going to be, underfunded and contentious. But I have a hunch that this will work if we commit to it. But let's give it a shot and let the evidence decide.
Well, what do you think it would look like if it was working well? Like, what do you think a society would feel like if science had its appropriate place in our culture?
I think, ironically, I don't think the funding situation would change much. I don't think it'd be there. There'd be like 10 times more funding for science. I think those funding for science would be seen year after year as an essential component of science, of our society. And it would hardly be even debated. Like, of course, the NSF, NASA, and okay, they get all their budgets and we're going to raise them every year because we raised overall budgets. It's just like a matter of course, and it's hardly debated. I would see in that ideal world, I would see far fewer scientific publications, certainly not 5.1 million made every year. There'd be a lot, research would be a lot slower. We would take our time. We would stamp out fraud. Any instances of fraud would be met with actual firing and loss of tenure, which actually rarely happens, surprisingly. I would see fewer science headlines. I would see fewer science news stories because there's less science being done. But what comes out is higher quality, is longer term, more structured, more careful research done by scientists. And then what is communicated to the public becomes, more secure, more interesting, more boundary pushing, more revelatory about the universe. And then there is more open dialogue about science, and that scientists have a seat at the policymaking table, seen as a valuable provider of information and guidance and wisdom. Not as a source of decision-making authority, but as a trusted source where we do these annual polls of the American population and trust in scientists skyrockets and it just stays there. That is what I want.
Sounds good. The book is Sickness in Science. Do you have a copy of it handy? Have they given you a proof yet?
So, yes, they have. I'll go grab it. It's right over here. They sent me, and we've had a change in title. It's Rescuing Science, Restoring Trust in an Age of Doubt. This is what is available on Amazon right now. And on my website, you can pre-order autographed copies from my website, pmsutter.com.
I like that title better.
Yes, it works. I actually, when they proposed it, I said, yeah, I like it. And that went along with the change in focus to put a lot more emphasis on solutions.
All right. Well, thanks, Paul. Great to talk to you as always. Now, but all the other stuff you're doing, if people want a regular Paul Matt Sutter dose, where do they get the information?
You get the feed from my website, pmsutter.com. Also follow me on social, primarily Instagram these days. I'm at Paul Matt Sutter. There are links, updates about any events I'm doing, links to articles I write, all that good stuff.
And your podcast.
Oh, my podcast, askaspaceman.com, a long-running podcast, wonderful community there, and I'd love it for anyone listening to join that community. People ask me questions, and then I get to pretend to know the answer.
Awesome.
But when I don't know, I say I don't know. I mean it.
Yeah. Awesome. All right. Well, thanks, man. It's always great to talk to you. Good luck with the book.
Thank you so much, Fraser.
I hope you enjoyed that conversation with Dr. Paul Sutter. And if you haven't already, go join his YouTube channel, subscribe to his podcast, check out his website. Paul's been a friend for years and years and years. And I really trust, he comes on this channel regularly and helps explain particle physics to me. So I think you should definitely go and follow what he's doing. Now, I'm going to give you some more thoughts about sort of this interview. But first, I'd like to thank our patrons. Thanks to Paul Rohrbach, Abe Kingston, Hey Twyla, Dougie Stewart, Stephen Krasaki, David Richards, Mark Anstis, Joel Yancey, and Tony Lofilara, Dustin Cable, Vlad Chiplin, Monzo, George, David Gilton, Andrew M. Gross, Jeremy Matter, Josh Schultz, and Jordan Young, who support us at the Master of the Universe level, and all of our other supporters on Patreon. This is a tricky problem, and we find ourselves in this time when you can just feel this public trust in science that is eroding, and just like a trust in expertise in general. And as a person who is such a fan of science and space specifically, it's heartbreaking to see the work of researchers be sort of dragged through the mud. People are flooding the zone with content. There's all kinds of moneyed interests that are attempting to drag it down. But as Paul says, like, there is some role that science has to play in improving its standing with the public. And, you know, many of the issues that Paul identifies in the book, I see where he's coming from. And I think it would be useful to figure out ways that we can address how many careers there are in the field of science, how work is done to make sure that it is the highest quality possible, how we can improve the way this information is communicated out to the public, and how we can get a more diverse set of voices that are working in the sciences that better match the needs of our planet. And so I think if any of this, if you're in the field of science or if you are sort of concerned about this, I think you'll probably get a lot out of Paul's book. Now, as I mentioned, I've talked to Paul quite a bit here on this channel. So I'm going to link to a couple of videos where he explains particle physics information to me. Check that out now. Thanks. We'll see you next time.